The North Vietnamese captured Hue City in 4 hours. It took American Marines 26 days to take it back. On the very first day, one company crossed a bridge with 150 men. 50 of them were casualties before they reached the other side. One bridge, one crossing, 1/3 of a company gone in minutes. So what exactly were these Marines walking into? And why did nothing in their training prepare them for it? This is the terrifying reality of American Marines at the Battle of Hue City. By January 1968, the Vietnam War had been grinding on for nearly 3 years, and Hue City occupied a unique position in it. It was the ancient imperial capital of Vietnam, a city of Buddhist temples, university buildings, tree-lined boulevards, and a massive walled fortress at its center called the Citadel, home to the former imperial palace. It was, by 1967, one of the only major cities in South Vietnam that had been largely untouched by the war. No major battles, no significant enemy presence. American and South Vietnamese commanders believed it was safe enough that they had stationed only a skeleton force there. The ARVN 1st Division headquarters sat inside the Citadel with a handful of support units. The nearest substantial American force was at Phu Bai, a Marine base 12 kilometers to the south. What the Americans and South Vietnamese did not know, what their intelligence had catastrophically failed to uncover, was that the North Vietnamese had been quietly infiltrating Hue for months. Soldiers disguised as civilians, weapons hidden in supply trucks, ammunition cached inside private homes. Between 15 and 18 Viet and Viet Cong battalions had assembled in and around the city, totaling an estimated 10,000 to 12,000 troops. They had studied the street layout. They had identified every key building, every bridge, every defensive position. They had done all of this in plain sight, and nobody had seen it. And here is where it gets interesting. The American commander in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, had his attention fixed somewhere else entirely. He was convinced the North Vietnamese were about to launch a massive assault on the Marine base at Khe Sanh, in the hills near the Laotian border. He had moved significant forces there. He had told Washington that Khe Sanh was the main event. Hue was not even on the threat map. It was about to become the most devastating urban battle of the entire Vietnam War. The men who would bear the weight of retaking Hue City were United States Marines, specifically units from the 1st and 5th Marine Regiments, Task Force X-Ray, operating out of Phu Bai. These were not men who had been trained for the kind of fighting they were about to face. Since arriving in Vietnam, the Marines had spent their time in jungles, in rice paddies, in open coastal terrain and highland forests. Their doctrine, their tactics, their instincts, all of it had been built around open ground warfare. House-to-house urban combat was a different discipline entirely, one that the United States military had last practiced seriously during the Korean War, 15 years earlier. Gunnery Sergeant John Canley was 31 years old when the battle began. He's a career Marine from California who had served in the Corps since 1956. He was the senior enlisted man in Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, one of the first units committed to the fight for Hue. Canley was the kind of Marine that junior men watched and tried to become. Calm, precise, experienced. He had survived everything Vietnam had thrown at him. He had never fought in a city. And here is the thing. When the first Marines arrived at the MACV compound in southern Hue on the morning of January 31st, they had almost no useful information. Nobody had briefed them on enemy positions. Nobody had maps of the city's street layout that were accurate enough to be used tactically. The initial estimate passed to the Marine commanders was that they were facing 3 enemy companies, roughly 300 to 500 men. The actual number inside Hue was closer to 12,000. The Marines were not walking into a fight. They were walking into a trap that had been months in the making, and they were walking into it almost completely blind. To understand what the Marines faced at Hue, you need to understand what urban combat actually does to a military force, because it is not like any other kind of fighting, and the differences are lethal. In open terrain, American firepower was decisive. Artillery, air support, helicopter gunships, all of it could be brought to bear with devastating effect. Urban terrain neutralizes every one of those advantages. You cannot call in an airstrike on a building when your own men are in the next building. You cannot use artillery when the enemy is across a narrow alley. You cannot use your superior numbers when the street is only wide enough for two men to walk side by side. The city takes everything that makes a modern military force powerful and strips it away, leaving individual soldiers facing individual decisions in spaces no larger than a living room. The Citadel of Hue was particularly brutal for this. Its walls were built in the early 19th century from massive stone blocks, 10 feet thick in places, designed to withstand siege warfare. The NVA had fortified hundreds of structures inside those walls, not just military buildings but houses, pagodas, market stalls, and the rooms of the former imperial palace itself. Each position had interlocking fields of fire. Each building had to be approached from a specific angle, or the Marines would be cut down in the open, and the NVA soldiers defending those positions had been preparing for weeks. They knew every alley. They knew every roof line. They knew exactly which windows gave clear shots at the approaches a Marine force would have to use. In the southern part of the city, the modern section below the Perfume River, the Marines found a different kind of hell. Multi-story concrete buildings, narrow streets, civilian structures that provided no cover and no concealment, grenades thrown from upper floors, snipers positioned in rooms with multiple escape routes. The effective range of combat in Hue was measured not in hundreds of meters but in tens, sometimes less. Men died at distances you could cover in 3 seconds at a sprint. The Marines who crossed into Hue on January 31st did so with whatever they had on hand. That was not much. The initial force, elements of Gulf Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, numbered around 250 men. They were going into a city held by an estimated enemy force that outnumbered them by a ratio of more than 40-1. They had no tanks, no artillery support close enough to be effective, no air support, because the weather over Hue in late January was catastrophic. A cold monsoon front had dropped the cloud ceiling to 300 feet, grounding fixed-wing aircraft and making helicopter operations nearly impossible for the first critical days of the battle. But here is the thing. Even if the weather had been clear, even if they had tanks from the first hour, the Marines would still have faced a fundamental problem that no amount of firepower could solve. The NVA had anticipated American air and artillery superiority and had built their defensive positions specifically to defeat it. They had placed their strongest firing positions on the ground floors of stone buildings so that bombs hitting the roof would not reach them. They had constructed interconnected firing positions so that clearing one room would immediately expose you to fire from the next. They had positioned snipers on upper floors with clear lines of sight to the streets below and multiple escape routes behind them. The Marines were also operating with almost no intelligence about what was in front of them. Lieutenant Colonel Ernie Cheatham, who would command the Marines fighting through the south side of the city, later described receiving orders so vague as to be nearly meaningless. He was told to clear the southern section of Hue. He was given no specific enemy positions, no order of battle, no assessment of enemy strength. He was told to do it any way he wanted. What that actually meant was that his Marines were going to have to learn the enemy's defensive layout by walking into it, and paying the price for every piece of information they gathered. At approximately 0800 hours on January 31st, 1968, the Marines of Gulf Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines were ordered to cross the Nguyen Huang Bridge, the main bridge spanning the Perfume River into the northern section of Hue. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Gravel led the assault with armor support, pushing one company across the bridge toward the Citadel. They made it across. They turned left, moving along the Citadel's southeastern wall, and within minutes they were in the most intense firefight any of them had ever experienced. A K-47 fire from multiple directions, B-40 rockets, machine guns firing from positions in the Citadel wall itself, elevated above the street and almost impossible to suppress with the weapons the Marines had available. Within 2 hours, a third of Company G had been killed or wounded. Gravel pulled his force back across the bridge and established defensive positions near the MACV compound. The first attempt to push directly into the Citadel had failed at devastating cost, and the battle had been underway for less than a morning. Meanwhile, in the southern city, the situation was developing its own brutal logic. The Marines of 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, with Gunnery Sergeant Canley and Alpha Company, were moving through streets that had been turned into killing grounds. The NVA had allowed the Marines to enter the city before opening fire, a deliberate tactical decision that placed the Americans inside the urban maze before engaging them, making retreat as dangerous as advance. Canley's company moved house by house, room by room, taking casualties at a rate that in any previous Vietnam engagement would have triggered a withdrawal. In Hue, there was nowhere to withdraw to. The battle was everywhere at once, and the Marines in the middle of it had no choice but to keep moving forward. What the Marines encountered in the streets of Hue City was unlike anything in the Vietnam War's history to that point. The NVA had turned every significant building into a fortress: the Tua Tien Provincial Headquarters, the hospital, the university, the Treasury Building, each one held by disciplined, prepared NVA regulars who had pre-positioned ammunition, food, and medical supplies. They were not going to run. They were not going to fade into the jungle the way the Viet Cong had in previous engagements. They intended to hold the city or die in it. The Marines developed their own brutal method for moving through the city. They called it mouse-holing. Rather than exposing themselves on the streets, which the NVA had zeroed in with preset fields of fire, the Marines would blow holes through the interior walls of buildings, moving from room to room, building to building, without ever stepping outside. They used C4 explosive charges, sledgehammers, whatever was available. They cleared each room before moving to the next. It was exhausting, dangerous, and slow. On a good day, a Marine unit might advance a single city block. On a bad day, they lost men gaining and holding ground measured in meters. Gunnery Sergeant John Canley was everywhere during those first days. When his company commander was wounded in the opening hours, Canley assumed effective command of the company, despite not holding the rank for it. He carried wounded Marines out of exposed positions under direct enemy fire on multiple occasions. He led assaults on NVA-held buildings when the situation demanded it. On one occasion, he was seen moving across open ground under sustained fire to drag a wounded Marine to cover, not once, but 3 times during the same engagement. The men around him later described his presence in those days as the thing that kept the company moving when everything inside them was telling them to stop. While the Marines were grinding through the southern city block by block, the fight for the Citadel to the north was producing its own particular horror. The Citadel was a different kind of battlefield, a walled fortress roughly 3 square miles in area, containing the former Imperial Palace and dozens of other significant structures, defended by NVA troops who had fortified positions that were centuries old and built to resist exactly this kind of assault. The 1st Battalion, 5th Marines entered the Citadel on February 13, 1968, nearly 2 weeks after the battle began. Their objective was to clear 16 city blocks in their assigned sector. After nearly 2 weeks of the most intense street fighting the Corps had seen since Korea, they had cleared those 16 blocks, at a cost of nearly 50% casualties. Half the battalion killed or wounded to take 16 blocks of a single city. That number deserves a moment. Not a single engagement. Not a single assault. 16 blocks. 50%. There is a detail about the Citadel fighting that most people who have heard of Hue do not know. In the final days of the battle, with the NVA still holding their last positions near the Imperial Palace itself, the Marines of 1st Battalion, 5th Marines were so depleted that they were fighting with lance corporals in squad leader positions and corporals commanding platoons. The men who should have been following orders were giving them, because the men who should have been giving them were dead or in the aid station. On February 25, 1968, the Marines fired 3 E-8 gas launchers, each carrying 40 CS tear gas grenades, into the NVA's final position. The next morning, they took the remaining 12 city blocks in 3 hours without a single casualty. The NVA, not equipped to deal with the gas, had withdrawn in the night. The battle for the Citadel was over. The city of Hue was back in Allied hands, and the cost had been devastating. Let me give you the numbers from the Battle of Hue City, because they tell a story that the men who sent those first Marines across the bridge were not prepared to face. United States Marines, 142 killed, 1,100 wounded. U.S. Army forces fighting in and around the city added another 108 killed and wounded. And South Vietnamese forces, the ARVN and the South Vietnamese Marines, suffered 458 killed and more than 2,000 wounded. Allied total, over 700 dead and more than 4,000 wounded in 26 days of fighting in a single city. On the other side, NVA and Viet Cong losses were estimated at between 1,000 and 5,000 killed, depending on the source. MACV claimed 5,133. Independent historians put the number closer to 2,400. The disparity tells you something about the confusion of urban combat. Even counting the dead was difficult when they were buried in rubble or had been carried away through the tunnels and alleys that the NVA used to move through the city. And then there were the civilians. Between 5,800 and 8,000 civilians died during the battle. Some in the crossfire, some in American airstrikes and artillery that were eventually called in despite the risk, and a significant number at the hands of the NVA itself. Between 2,800 and 6,000 civilians were executed by NVA and Viet Cong political cadres during the occupation, taken from their homes, marched to the outskirts of the city, and shot or buried alive in mass graves that were discovered in the months and years following the battle. The Hue Massacre remains one of the largest single atrocities of the Vietnam War, and that right there tells you everything about what 26 days in one city actually cost. When the fighting finally ended on March 2, 1968, the Marines who walked out of Hue were not the same men who had walked in. The city had cost them something that statistics could not measure, something in the way they understood what war actually was and what it could demand from a person. The veterans of Hue described the experience in terms that set it apart from everything else they had seen. Not louder than other battles, not faster, just different, more personal, more relentless. The kind of fighting where you could see the man trying to kill you, and he could see you, and neither of you had anywhere to go. Gunnery Sergeant John Canley survived the battle. He was eventually recommended for the Medal of Honor for his actions during those first days, a recommendation that was approved in 2018, 50 years after the battle, after a decades-long review of the evidence. When asked about Hue in later years, Canley described it the way many veterans of the battle described it, not with anger, and not with pride exactly, but with a kind of flat precision. He had done what was necessary. The men around him had done what was necessary. That was what there was to say about it. What Hue changed in the American military was significant. The battle forced a fundamental reassessment of urban warfare doctrine, something that had been neglected for a generation. It produced new training programs, new tactical manuals, new thinking about how to fight in cities that would be applied in every conflict that followed. The lessons of Hue, about the limits of firepower, the primacy of the individual soldier, the way a determined enemy can neutralize overwhelming technological advantage by choosing the right terrain, those lessons proved durable. They were still being studied at military academies when American forces entered Fallujah in 2004. The Battle of Hue City was not a victory that felt like one. The city was retaken. The NVA were driven out. The Allied commanders could report success to their governments, but the Marines who fought there knew what success at Hue had actually required, what it had taken from the men who did it, and what it had left behind in the rubble of an ancient city that had once been considered too important to fight over. Hue changed how the Vietnam War was understood at home. The images that came out of it, Marines in firefights on the grounds of an imperial palace, the ruins of temples, and the bodies in the streets, reached an American public that had been told the war was being won. What they saw did not look like winning. It looked like something else entirely. Some places ask more of the men sent to fight in them than any training can prepare you for. Hue was one of those places. The Marines who answered that ask did not do it because the odds were good. They did it because there was nobody else. Subscribe. There are more stories on this channel that history left out. More.